we are only having a short round table with a concluding round table, okay? And now, so I would ask Professor João Paulo Oliveira Costa to the table, and Professor Farhat Hassan to join me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I will
thank you.
Because I know that I could attend, and then I will leave. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much. See you soon.
You are with us? Space for you.
Okay, so now this is working. It is. Okay. So these were really two very interesting days, right? With some presentations that were amazing in their own field. There was a huge variety of subjects and of approaches as well. And so it was very enriching. And I would like to say to all of you that we will try to put the recording sessions online for you to see it. And further on, we will try to publish the proceedings of this conference. Okay, so I wanted to make this announcement firsthand. And then I asked both professors to come here to this table because I'm very interested to know about the future. I want to know what will happen next in this field of Indo-Portuguese history or studies, right? What will come next? So you go first. Okay.
So once again, thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this final roundtable. And thank you all of you who have been here for these 2 days and enrich it so much because we have presentations, but we have also the interaction with many of you. And I think that it was very enriched all of us, and it was very important. Mm-hmm. I should say first to say that we have always this difficulty of the distance and to know each other, and only if we keep doing events like this one that now in this case Instituto Camões and Dr. João Ribeirete promoted, we can develop much more our both historiographies in what they have of differences by nature of even of the acknowledgement or the knowledge of sources. We know I use very well my European sources, but I don't use Marathi or Bengali or other sources, as you know. And so this, if we don't make that cooperation should be important. What I can say is that first about what as an academic, what I brought for me and for my work from this conference. One of the things is something that we developed for a long time, but now it seems that even among Indian scholars, I listened from a different way that I was used, is the perception more clear than when you are speaking about Estado da Índia. We are not speaking about Europeans, but much more about Asians, in the sense that, yes, there was a European elite that ruled always the basic interesting that we had in Goa, there were some families of aristocracy, Portuguese aristocracy that moved to Goa in the middle of the 16th century. They never married with Indian women, so they kept Europeans in blood for 2 centuries. But they got positions as governors of Macau, of Mozambique, but they never were viceroys. Viceroys were coming always from Portugal. That's what there is a Portuguese rule of the Estado da Índia, but I think that someone asked, yes, who were the Portuguese? The Portuguese were Asian people. Asian people, like most, they looked much more like you than like me. Most of those Portuguese of the Estado de India, they looked much more you. They knew the language that you know much more than my Portuguese language. And so this is, I think this happened to India, has it happened to Japan, has happened to China, has happened to the Indonesia or Timur. So I think that it's very important that we come across that when the Portuguese met the Mughals, they were seen as an Asian power and with experience. So that's I think that is an important move that 40 years ago didn't exist for sure. And speaking about Sardinians was only to speak about colonial in a very opposite dimension. I think that's a great evolution that we must share, and we can make it deeper and deeper. I think that we can also have, so as you understood, I'm going to fly out. Ernestine is already flying to Goa. I'm going to Goa tomorrow to keep this interaction now with this first experience of having a small seminar of our brand, but now looking for just for teaching, for teaching. I realized that, as I told you, we expect to do the next the seminar. We expect to do it in January 2027 about perceptions, about how do nowadays we perceive history. So how the history of the interaction of the presence of Portuguese in Asia is perceived today by Europeans, by Asiatics from all the nations, and so on. But we can also we are not going to stop, and I think that finally we may have partners to make more Portuguese and Marathi history or Portuguese and Bengali history. I thought, and that I invited you to also to cooperate in that sense. What I can offer more is that, as we told, nowadays for us what is easy is to travel. We have resources to travel much more than to invite. We can invite also, but it's always more difficult. So we have disponibility for interaction by internet, by creating whatever chats or whatever intervention that we can meet sometime in a certain regularity about our themes. But I hope that I hope that all of you will be aware about our call for the next major seminar, and some of you for sure can be there and to attend it in Lisbon, or then in 2029 in Cochin. But we can organize everything else that you wish. I can say that for my university, it's not only me, I'm here, but I have a number of colleagues that always deal with Asian history that have been in other seminars several times. And we have conditions to come here personally to interact, just to make lectures, to explain what we are doing there. That is something that, as you can understand, as I think you understand easily, we'll enjoy very much to come here. We enjoy very much India as a civilization, as a society, and so it's not never an effort. It's only to have time among our classes to come here. But we came very easily. And we would like also that you come there if we can get the conditions, because and I end with this. It is very, as a person like me that for 40 years that is working on this field, it's so different nowadays. And for better, of course. And for better, not because our old professors and all the colleagues were not able to do better, because they were starting from zero, almost zero, or and nowadays we have all the background that they created, and that we can develop, and that's what I think that as academics, our major responsibility is to develop and to head to what the others did before, to make always science getting better. And you can count on me. I hope to count on you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. So, Professor Hassan.
I thought this was a fantastic suggestion. I think there should be more conversations of this kind, and we should meet more often. I believe this has been a fantastic seminar in the sense that we were able to engage with, with the specialists in varied languages. So we have someone from Bengali, someone from Marathis, Najaf doing Persian source material. I think the real challenge in working on themes like this is the challenge of language, because the archive is so rich, the archive is multilingual, and for that reason it's important to engage with the scholars from varied linguistic registers to be able to have a more complete picture about the Portuguese presence in India. I thought it was also fantastic that we had a very long time range from the 14th to the 19th century, and we had some very fine scholars, people like Professor Amar Faruqi, Professor Lakshmi, and my perpetual critic, Najaf Haider. I thought this was a very fantastic thing, and I think, yeah, we should take this forward. We should, and I think two things come to my mind. One is to have more workshops of this kind, and also a publication in near future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I would like to ask you if you want to add anything.
Yeah, you really want to say something.
The microphone is there. I'm not there. I can. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone involved for an absolute dream of 2 days. I think we are all still bubbling with the richness that we've encountered. I just had a few comments which originally had to do with the previous pre-lunch session on Mughal interactions with the Portuguese, but since they were comments rather than questions, I thought it's better to leave it to this current session, because I think in hindsight they do apply to the conference at large as well. Not just in terms of what we can take away, but also in terms of what we can take forward. The first comment that I had was about continuing to question and problematize the idea of the Portuguese in the South Asian and Indian Ocean worlds as a maritime empire or a maritime empire alone, right? I'm sure as far as the best scholarship in this field is concerned, they've been doing this for a while, or they will continue doing this. But I feel that there's this overarching sense of them being oriented with the coast and the high seas and so on and so forth. Whereas what we know and what we've encountered over these 2 days would suggest anything but, right? So, funnily enough, when we had Dr. Flores over at the Department of History in Delhi University with his book, with his then recently published book many years back, I was very generously chosen as a student who presented on his book along with Professor Sunil Kumar. And it was lovely to revisit a lot of what he has documented in his work today as well. And while it is undoubted that as compared to South America, for instance, there were far fewer boots on the ground, as it were, here. And they were mostly restricted to the coastline and the ports and enclaves. But if you look at Portuguese ambitions in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the vast geopolitical canvas that they were encountering, but also inhabiting and trying to, what's the word, influence, right? It's mind-boggling, right? So there is a point towards the end of the 16th and the first half of the 17th centuries when the Portuguese are in direct diplomatic relationships, but also intrigues with two of the major Deccani sultanates, Ahmednagar and Bijapur, of course, who skirt the western coastline. But the Mughals, Kabul for a while, as long as it's under Akbar's half-brother. The Uzbek Sultanate in Central Asia under Abdullah Khan Uzbek, and the Safavids. So this is a remarkable spread that can even put to shame the Russo-British great game of the 19th century. And Dr. Flores charts how they're constantly trying to kind of pit one against the other, or see where the power relations lie, and keeping a very close eye on how these balances are shifting and changing. Also, the other thing is to look at how these relationships are taking shape over land as well, again, to kind of extend my original point. Because if you think about the mosaic from yesterday, which I can't stop thinking about, obviously that whole journey of its transmission from the east to the west was probably much more of a land-based transmission rather than an oceanic or a water-based one, right? And even though that's from late antiquity, there's no reason to only limit ourselves to water networks in the medieval and the early modern and the modern periods as well. And I'm sure there's much more to be unearthed. I think the greatest fallacy anyone from the academic world can do or say is to suggest that everything that has to be said has already been said. The other comment that I had was about constantly accounting for the unequal power equations, relationships and dynamics that exist in these relationships of exchange, collaboration, and also contestation. Again, this is really coming from the previous session that we had, because we love to talk about the Jesuit missions, for instance, cultural exchanges and all of that, which is amazing. But they're always couched within power dynamics, right? And their conclusions or their final results would eventually lead from that. I think I'm also from that school where I look at texts and intellectual exchange as instruments of power, partly because I did study under Professor Hassan, and that stays with me and will always stay with me. But my general academic pessimism at large.
Sorry for misleading you.
No. I certainly don't look at it that way. But yeah, I think I've been converted for life. But if we look at the Jesuit missions as one particular example, whether it's the appointing of a tutor for Prince Murad, or whether it's all these high nobles like Mukarrab Khan, for instance, and the others, we see that eventually the consequence or the final outcome still remains within the control of whoever it is that occupies the high ground, right? So none of the Mughal princes or emperors convert. None of the major nobles that we've spoken about convert at the end, right? And the Jesuit presence or the missionary presence remains kind of restricted eventually, even though they have high hopes, especially in Goa originally. And even the last presentation that we had, this amazing presentation about ethnography, we keep coming back to that whole question of power dynamics and power equations, right? So that was my second comment. And last but not the least, since there was a question in the last session about the long-term life of these collaborations and the outcomes of the millenarian, ideas that flowed from these Portuguese-Mughal debates and encounters. I was just wondering how, in addition to what Professor Hassan said in his own response and answer to that question, it's incredible how just after the high point of these interactions and with the emergence of these millenarian ideas, the nomenclature of the regnal titles of the Mughal emperors shift drastically. So you go from Turkish and then Perso-Arabic or Persian names like Babur and Humayun and Akbar to titles that always suggest a universal overlordship. So you have Jahangir, you have Shah Jahan, you have Alamgir, and then you have Shah Alam, right? And it's fascinating how through the 18th century, as the Mughals drastically drop off and go into their fabled decline, as it were, these titles don't go out of favor, right? So there is a Shah Jahan II in the middle of the 18th century. There is a Shah Alam II who rules when Delhi itself is captured by the British, and the final bastion of not Mughal power, but Mughal symbolic presence is also taken over by a colonial power. So I think there are these intricate ways in which, symbolically at least, the conclusions of those debates and the intermingling of those ideas survive, even though the ground reality, politically speaking, is very different. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor João for mentioning about the collaborations that we can do depending on specifically the linguistic sources that we have. I just wanted to mention like 2-3 things very briefly. First is this, that the legacy, the past which was there, is still living in a way that today, even if you go to Goa, the best sports person in Goa is given an award called the Jeevba Dada Kirkar Award, which is named after a person who was born in Goa and who became a general in the army of the Shindis of Gwalior, came to the north, lived in Delhi, went to the Punjab, lived there, wrote letters, which we still have in the archives, interestingly, but still maintained a contact with Goa and with Portuguese. So what kind of conversations were happening during that time period when people like Jeevba Dada Bakshi Kirkar, a Brahmin from Goa, working for a person of Maratha origin? And the last paper that was presented, interestingly, was talking about the Kunbis. Now, Kunbi community particularly is very interesting because, like Professor Najaf Haider also mentioned about the Kurmis of North India, the dialogue between you know, whether the Kurmis and the Kunbis are the same, what are the similarities, what are the differences, and what is the process of Kunbis changing into the Shahanav Kuli Marathas or the 96 Kuli Marathas. Because over the period of time in the 18th century and even before, we find that people from these tribal communities, you know, the Kunbis particularly, rising up the ladder and getting the entry within the elite Maratha ranks. And today again we say, when the movement for reservation is going on in Maharashtra amongst the Maratha community, what they're saying is we need Kunbi certifications from the Nizam times. In a way, they're happy to acknowledge the fact that they are Marathas and they were ruling and they were rulers and all that, but at the same time, they also don't want to abnegate or completely deny that they have some kind of a Kunbi origin. So when the professor mentioned about the tribal origin of the Kunbis and the gods, the local gods, so I was thinking about the fact that even today, you know, even after these families are migrated from the Konkan coast, to the north, they still continue to worship certain gods, their main gods, the Ishtadevtas, the main deities of the families who are not part of the main pantheon, the Vedic pantheon or the Puranic pantheon. For instance, in the case of the Holkars, they have Mallari Martand. Now, Mallari Martand's main temple, you'll find in Zazuri near Pune. And the influence of the coast, Portuguese influence, other influences can still be seen. You know, for the case of Shindes of Gwalior, it is Jyotiba. Very you can say, conventional or part of the great Vedic pantheon. The stories were made about how did these gods or deities come into existence. For instance, in the case of Jyotiba, they said that the top three gods, the Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, the trinity of the Hindu pantheon, Puranic pantheon, they along with the anger of Jamdagni, a saint, they created a god to go and fight against a demon that was ruling in the Kolhapur region called Ratnasura, near Vadi Ratnagiri, named after that demon. And this person goes and fights against Ratnasura, defeats and establishes kingdom, and hence he came to be called Dakkhancha Raja Jyotiba, the king of Dakkhan Jyotiba. And the rulers who came after that, and even though they went from the Konkan coast all towards the north to Delhi, like my dear friend was talking about Shah Alam, that was a time period where Delhi was primarily under Maratha control. So even after moving towards the north, the fascination they had for their customs, particularly, you know, customs which are not very much Brahmanical, so to say, in origin, but based out of their, you know, tribal past, their Kunbi past or other past, are still being celebrated. Because in the case of these families that had interaction with the Portuguese, initially, they took certain elements from them which can still be observed in religious ceremonies. If observed, you know, with great precision, and seriously when we observe, we say this doesn't appear to be a proper Marathi kind of a setup. There's some influence, like for instance, yesterday I did not get an opportunity to add this, that even today when you go to the palace and you see the tiles there, the azulejos tiles on the first floor, and you look at them, you're like, they're so Moorish and Portuguese in origin. Who got them? Why were they added in this particular area? So this shows that thousands of kilometers away from, you know, from Goa, from the Estado de India, the area where the Portuguese had their control, all the way up to the north. Because as I mentioned, even today, when you will be visiting Goa, you talk to people, who is your hero? They will say, oh, Deepaji Rane. Who is your other hero? They will say, Jiba Dada Kirkar, because we get a sports award in his name by the government of Goa. Now this Jiba Dada Kirkar, even though he knew Portuguese, he knew Marathi, he was living in Delhi and campaigning in the Punjab. So what kind of sources were produced during that time? They need to be studied and cross-verified with different other sources, and there comes the idea of collaboration between Portuguese scholars and scholars who, you know, have the resources, particularly the primary sources in those particular languages. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That's the goal, is to have people speaking. That's the goal. Yes, please. Yeah, no. Any other comments or questions? Thank you so much for your comments. They were both very interesting. Yes.
Sorry, I came a bit late. I was at the archives doing some research on Portugal in India. No, I'm just
Okay,
joking.
okay, good to know.
But I was just wanting to pick up on what I mentioned yesterday about maybe there are parts of India where probably the Portuguese colonized in some ways, which, like Odisha I'm talking about, where they came in with plants, they had stayed out there, taxations, they had settlements, you would guess, from family anecdotes. So is it possible to put together some structure by which these regions of India which are lesser known, but where the Portuguese certainly made an impact and are very much a part of the local folklore and narrative, and get some actual solid content behind it? Is there some way to collaborate, say, between Odisha and an initiative in Portugal?
Yes, that's a very good question. I don't know if you want to add something. No? Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question without an answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, obviously
Yes.
we can consider that as a very viable option.
Just one more point. The connection and the connection between Goa, Portugal, and Brazil, that is also something which needs to be studied, because when we go through certain sources, I mean, in recent times you have people like Dr. Freulano de Mello, who was of Goan origin, went and studied in Portugal, then went to Brazil, and also Ursula de Meyer, the famous book, Senhora de Panjim, the lady who came all the way from Brazil, came to Goa, and later fought against the Marathas. So the collaboration and the conversation that was happening between the Goans, the Portuguese, and the Brazilians, that is also something which needs to be explored, I feel.
Any other comments? Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I'll join my colleague, friend Professor Hassan, in saying that the sessions have been very, very productive, fruitful, stimulating. I learned personally a lot and wish to learn more, obviously, which is why I'm making these requests. The first request is of course, to strengthen the theme which we call commercial and cultural encounters, which take care of the whole world of maritime trade, commodities, merchants, techniques, and the whole implication of that. And of course, cultural encounters, which include practically everything, ideas and other things, writing of books, religious exchanges. So I think that these themes, even though they might seem as thrice squeezed orange, they have still an astonishing amount of juice, which we can, of course, make use of. The second request is about translation. Translation of sources and scholarly works in Portuguese which are not accessible to us in India, unfortunately, because the language of instruction in many universities like ours is English, and our students are trained to read English sources translated. They actually would like to read Persian sources also in English.
Well,
we can discourage them to do that,
well,
but
that question might be directed to the Portuguese students that I have here, and that they might become translators in the future.
yeah.
You know?
No,
So
my first suggestion would be to learn Portuguese, of course.
yes.
But with AI and all other aids that we have, I think any project of translation should not be private or personal. It should be somewhat institutional to say whether what we are getting is the right product, both in terms of translating sources. I remember reading the Book of Monsoons in English, translated in 17th century East India Company records, because they wanted to know what the Portuguese were doing earlier. And I wonder whether there is any English version of the Book of Monsoons, for instance. So that's what I mean, and of course there are much more, there's much more than that. So these two, sources and essays, scholarly essays in Portuguese, which we can't access because they are not available to us in English. I can tell you that in a conference in Doshambe, I met scholars who made such scholarly presentations, and we had not heard about them or read their work because they were all in Russian. And a whole new world opened because they made their presentations in English for the first time there. So this is the kind of language problem that we face in accessing sources which are not in the language that we read. Then my last request is two requests, but we can couple them together, is to pay a little more attention to visual material. Paintings, illustrations, maps, pictures. History is one of those fascinating disciplines which has no bar and has the most wide repertoire of sources.
If I may say so, on your presentation and Arunaj's presentation as well, I was completely appalled with the quality of the paintings. They were so beautiful, especially yours.
So I
want to know more about those paintings.
Inspired by European, Portuguese paintings, prints, woodcuts, other media which came, and of course we also know that there were people who were explaining how to make, for instance, clouds, which were Chinese till then. So this visual material thing. And finally, related to that is a little more emphasis on material culture, history of objects, which a single object can, and I keep reading about different kinds of objects which came from Portugal via Goa, or came directly when they came to directly to Gujarat, and these objects are described in our sources, but we don't have them. So I'm not saying that we should have them, but whatever objects we have, if it's possible for us to catalog them, have their photos, descriptions. A Chinese vase has been unearthed recently with an inscription which resolves some long-standing issue about weight, because the weight is inscribed in two different, it's a bit like the Rosetta Stone, which helps. So these objects, but preferably with inscriptions, but even without inscriptions, if it's possible for us to study them and correlate them with textual material and make the study of Indo-Portuguese encounters more and more interesting and more viable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Back there, back there.
So thank you so much. I had it was like a feast for me for 2 days of just not the food, but then of course the presentations and the kind of presentations, meaning it covered almost every aspect of Indo-Portuguese relationship. Now I came here not because I am in I study, as in my research is on maritime trade, or the expertise is not there, but I teach papers of medieval history where we look at European Mughal relation and Europe-India relationship. So in that case I had come, but of course I'm going back with a lot of takeaways. So what my suggestion would be that I think they can, because my own research is on the region of Rajasthan, and I look at the social community history, the community. So I think the last presentation that was made online was very, very interesting and very rare in terms of what we have explored so far in the Indo-Portuguese history or relationship. We've been maybe overwhelmed by the maritime and the architecture and the main regions of where Portuguese had made impact. Of course, while I looked at the internet yesterday about what was Portuguese and Rajasthan relationship, I couldn't find anything much on it. And I would when I go to the archives next, I would try and explore some material on what was it or where did it start, because the internet says 19th century. But maybe as a historian, I would like to take it back and see where was it. It's saying 19th century, but what can I dig out from the archive to be able to see and date back to? And of course, from the 19th century. But I think what we can really also focus, apart from what has been discussed, is also the impact of the Portuguese coming in terms of society, to the women, to the community. What kind of changes are happening in culturally in terms of this kind of a relationship that Portuguese men are having with Indian men, Portuguese men with like the entire the discussion, and not discussion, but the exchange of cultural, social aspects of this interaction that has historically been documented so far. But then I think there's much more scope in kind of unearthing social community history between the Indo-Portuguese historical narrative. I think there's a lot of scope there. I'm not sure of the material what we can dig into in terms of different regions and different areas that Portuguese have made presence but this can be a thinking point of exploring the social and community history also. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you, absolutely.
I was just wondering, because there was shortage of time in organizing this seminar, what we are missing in this panel is, the depictions of Portuguese in our sculptures. There are many temples in South India, at Padakkal and other places, where you will find Portuguese traders along with Chinese traders. They are depicted. In the Vijayanagar area, you will find them. I have seen quite a few.
Okay.
So that aspect should also be brought into the context.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think what Professor Farooqi's paper, which talked about drugs and smuggling,
opium,
was fascinating, because that trail leads all the way to the Macau and other regions, and that's a whole, and it's and it appears in several narratives of stories and so on in the eastern region. So I think that is something that can be pushed a little more. I don't know, Professor Farooqi, how much you've read. I'm, as I said, Johnny come lately into this area, but that was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating paper and presentation, and it overlaps with the espionage trope that we encountered this morning of having different kinds of people posted in different ways, and exploring different kinds of social configurations. So, the ones which are outcasts, in a sense, lie beyond the pale of governed societies, governance. So, if there's something that we can read, we would love a reading list. I think that's my suggestion also. Each one of you has a reading list, an essential reading list. For some of us who are studying the area, some essential readings would be very useful if you can post them.
That's a good
and
suggestion.
they would really be, seminal works, things you've mentioned already, authors you've mentioned already, and some literature around that. So we would really appreciate, I would very much appreciate a reading list.
Good, yeah.
Thank you.
Would Professor Farooqi like to
with the proceeding,
offer some
perhaps
suggestions?
That's possible to add. to
Professor
the
Farooqi
proceedings.
would
Like essential bibliography on this subject, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good,
good
that we,
suggestion.
kind of reading list which would be of use to, I mean, for all of us. I mean,
obviously.
I missed Farhat's and Najaf's presentation
No, you
this
missed
morning.
nothing.
But
You missed nothing except the bickering and the fighting.
Yes, they were fighting. They were fighting.
No, I would actually like to go back to something that Professor Subramaniam yesterday was talking about. Of course, her keynote address had such a broad sweep. but she was referring to the long presence that the Portuguese have had in India, and we need to be aware of the different phases. I mean, 500 years is a very long time, and they are there through several phases, and the historical context actually undergoes considerable change. And here I would just like to sort of refer to something that she mentioned regarding some of the writings like Rochelle Pinto's work on the late 19th century, early 20th century, where she's looking at issues like nationalism, the impact that the national movement in India is having on Goa, and the other way around, because ideas emanating from Goa are also influencing intellectuals in Bombay, in Maharashtra, and parts of Western India. So I think that needs to be taken into account. I think there has been a kind of reluctance. For reasons that not clear for me, and I think that is reflected in the papers in this conference as well, to engage with the closing decades of Portuguese presence in India. Of course, part of the reason is that the relationship was embittered in that closing phase. A lot of that had, of course, to do with the Salazar dictatorship, and of course, when we are sort of celebrating the 50th, the restoration of the diplomatic relations, it is also a celebration of the change which came about in Portugal itself in the 1970s, the ousting the dictatorship in the in period immediately following Salazar's death. So that the fact that relationship in that closing phase got so embittered, there has been a kind of reluctance to address historical questions relating to what was happening in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. We, in fact, know so much more about what was happening in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and we know so little about what was happening in the sort of second quarter of the 20th century. Perhaps the one work which really comes to my mind is that brilliant memoir by Maria Aurora Couto about that closing phase Goa daughter's story, which really is about her family, her father staying behind in Goa because the frontiers are going to now close. The threat that the frontiers were closed and the family moving out of Goa. And how deeply rooted the father is. He has no political stakes at all. He's unemployed. And yet, he's so deeply sort of rooted in a culture which he doesn't want to give up. The very idea that he won't be able to go to his favorite cafe in Panjim and listen to his favorite music, is something which becomes such a problem for him that he doesn't even accompany his family. So I think, that was something which is so revealing when I was reading that memoir. It was so revealing of the anxieties of that phase. So the point I'm making is that that is something which really needs a little more attention. And given the fact that there's a lot of archival material, there are memoirs, there is correspondence, there is a lot of material where we need to actually get beyond the diplomatic, political aspects of the relationship to see actually what's happening in Goa and Goan society. And may I add, another absence, which is that we have paid very little attention to what was happening in Daman, in Diu, in those years. So what's going on in Goa perhaps is known a little better, even though it's not really very well known. Yet Daman and Diu are complete sort of absence, and that's again something which I think needs to be addressed. And perhaps this might be an occasion to think a little more about research on those issues.
I'd like to make a comment. We can
please,
following I think very interesting because as we have now, we have here a lot of students that are learning Portuguese and most of us we are interested in a way or another in what was the Portuguese impact, let's say, so in India along 500 years. So, and all the lacks of themes that have not been yet studied enough, they have new protagonists for doing so. We have people to tend. I'd like just to explain two or three things about Portugal concerning to that. When we started, two different things. When this seminar started, because I come back to when I was starting my license in Portugal, there was not little people making history, and they were doing imperial history of the conquests and all that history. Very, very nice to the meaning, to the mind of Salazar, and so it was a history against the others. No? It was a history of triumph, and that's what they wanted to do, and just based on the chronicles, more or less. And then we evolved. In the 80s and in the 90s, most of the historians who wanted to deal with the history of the Portuguese expansion were interested in Asia. But then there was a trend in the beginning of this century that Brazil took us out. I mean, almost of the students. Most of the students went to Brazil. It's easier because sources are only in Portuguese. So and unfortunately they did a history of colonial without the indigenous. So it was easy just to look how the European society moved to Brazil, ignoring what was all the interaction with indigenous that they said we massacred them, so we have not to speak about who was massacred, but they were not so massacred. They were much more integrated, and they were as it happened in Asia, also in America. It was due to the alliances with groups of indigenous that the Portuguese was able to settle there, and it was with the allied indigenous that they fought the other indigenous, and they went to the interior. It's true that also we didn't so. Ernestine is already flying to go, but Ernestine is a specialist on the 18th century. And in the 90s, in the seminar, she was the last to speak, because we did it by a certain chronological organization. So she dealing with the 18th century was the last, and so nobody was speaking about the 19th and about the 20th century. Because it was a very imperialistic story about the roots of this. Now it's different. In the last seminar last year, we had already papers on Goan society in the 20th century. So it is an evolution, and I think the right evolution. As well as in Portugal now, what we have is a group of history of architecture that are also evolving in this about the 20th century. That I think is a very nice group. But just to emphasize that we notice all those areas that are not very well covered, but it means that we have all, because there is the idea that history is made. No, history is nothing is made. Everything is to be made, and so this is to exhort the young people who is here, the most young people. As I am still enthusiastic to do new things, but feel you have much more time. This is a field of research that is interesting, and what is important as a Portuguese to listen from you is that the way you are expressing that it was not usual 30 years ago, that you are expressing about how these Portuguese who came to the coast and who were settled in an organized way in the coast, finally they are interesting for many other. That is the legacy of Lotica Varadarajan, because in 1998, when she organized the first seminar here in Delhi, that was what she wanted to do. He says, look beyond the Estado da India to see the Portuguese in India, and that's what you keep being interested in. So we can do it for sure. Thank you.
I will just add to what Professor Farooqi was saying, about our independence movement and what was vis-a-vis Goanese people. Congress party had sent one delegation to convince the local people to fight against the Goa regime. And in the initial stage, it is well documented. I have read some of them. These people were asked by the Goani people, indigenous people, or you say Goa people, that please go out of Goa. We are fine with these people. They were rejected. So this delegation came back and reported it to Congress High Command that look here, they are not So these experiences should be documented and studied.
I very quickly want to.
It's a wonderful film. I have seen it. There's a song that agony of a
memoirs being
family.
converted into a film in Hindi. I can't remember, but I'll find it.
Yeah, I just also wanted to piggyback on what Professor Farooqi said, because in Bengal, in the mid to late 18th century, the British colonial oppression in the recently conquered province of Bengal after 1757 was being actively observed by the French in Chandernagore. And while there were certain French officials and governors who tried to help the Bengalis, but more importantly, these experiences and their observations were constantly being relayed back to Paris and to the French government and the French people back home. And I had no idea, of course, growing up, but recently I was reading about how these observations in Bengal and the British acts and violations in Bengal directly influenced Enlightenment writing in France in the late 18th century, which then snowballed into the French Revolution. So I'm sure there's a very similar process happening with the national movement and also the colonial experience in South Asia vis-a-vis Goa, and then, I mean, that being kind of relayed back to Portugal in some way or the other, and how that interaction is taking place. So that would be a fascinating field of study.
Just want to add to what Professor Farooqi was talking about, and want to recollect something which João knows. So we had a session at the Camões Institute where dear Antonio attended it, and we were having a conversation about the mosaic.
It was
on
in
which,
site. It
yes,
was not online. He was there.
we were there, and we were having a conversation about India-Portugal relationship, and the questions that we got were, Professor, about Lusotropicalism, about Salazar, things that, were not at all related to that encounter between Megas Alexandros and Porus and all that Hidaspes. The people themselves were more interested to know, as you rightly said, Professor Farooqi, about that phase of Indo-Portuguese history when they were moving out of India. So the questions they were asking is that what was the ideology of Salazar? And as like Professor Najaf Haidar was mentioning about the movie, I don't know if there was Junior Mahmood in it or somebody. No.
It was Victor Banerjee, I think.
Okay. No, sure. Yeah. Okay. Because there's an old movie which I'm just forgetting, because there's a poem in that there's this lines written about Salazar in Hindi that, jab na raha Changiz ka nizam baki to kaisa rahega Salazar baki, something like that. It's an old movie which was quoted by some people and said that, even in Bollywood before, long before, these kind of themes were taking up. And again, coming back to what Professor Farooqi was saying, people like Tristão da Cunha, Luís Menzies Braganza, and Ram Manohar Lohia, those who interacted with that nationalistic movement that was taking place in Goa. And what kind of ideology came out of Goa? Why did we have something like the Maharashtravadi Gomantak Party? Why was this idea that Goa, some people believe that Goa should be a part of Maharashtra? Or why is it that Chhatrapati Shivaji's idols, statues can be seen everywhere in Goa nowadays? Why is this kind of movement coming up? Outside Goa. So that kind of, this needs to be studied. Why this nationalistic movement that happened during that time, and also the relationship that was between the local people, Luís Menzies de Braganza was from Chandor, if I'm not wrong, the old Chandranagar, which was the capital of the old Gomantak. And, the dynamics which was there between the Brahmins, the Bamons, and, the Kshatriya converts to Catholicism. What was their the dynamics? In addition to that, their relationship with the larger Maratha kingdom that existed during the kingdom time, and even later during the independence movement time. What kind of conversation were they having with Maharashtra politicians? May it be Luís de Menzies Braganza, Tristão da Cunha, Ram Manohar Lohia, of course, not from that region, but all this needs to be studied in far more detail and presented in conferences like this.
Okay, yes. So, thanks a lot for all of these questions. we have a path on before us, in front of us. So we all we have to do is to go through that path. Okay, and I hope that after this conference there are several, and that some of those topics are in that future conferences that will follow. Thank you very much for your presence and for everything. Thank you.